Okay, well, it looks like it is noon and we'll get started. We're changing things up a little bit this year on the day before Thanksgiving. Dr. Matt Helmers decided that he would be the one to do the Wednesday before Thanksgiving webinar. And I think his topic is really appropriate for a day, for a week when we're thinking about things we have to be grateful for. I know Matt is really grateful to have grown up around a farm up in what he calls God's country, near Sibley. So, this is going to be a really interesting talk. This is work that Dr. Helmers started to look at about a decade ago. He was interested to see if we looked at a farm over time, what could we learn about it? And more importantly, what could it teach us about the future? So I'm Jacqueline Comito. This is the Iowa Learning Farms webinar, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Jackie.
Oh, I
Uh,
forgot to tell people if they have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat and we'll deal with them afterwards.
yeah, okay. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks for those of you that have logged on today. I don't think it will be quite as interesting as Jackie's before Thanksgiving webinars, but I'll do my best. And I'm going to talk a little, yeah, as Jackie said, a little about some work we did a number of years ago, looking at kind of a farm or small watershed in Northwest Iowa, and what we can learn about what might have been or might be some of the changes in sediment and nutrient loss from that area, and what we might be able to do in the future to reduce some of that sediment and nutrient loss. So if you saw the press release for this. This is a picture. This is three generations: my grandfather in the largest one, my father in the upper right, and myself in the lower right. Um, we all showed cattle. I think the large one on the left was the grand champion steer at the Osceola County Fair in 1942 or 1943, and the lower right, obviously 1990. So something that we all uh, had in common. And those of you that know me, you can get me off track if you start talking about cattle. Um, Also, I started looking at some history of um, uh, family history and thinking about the last 100 years and how some things have changed. So I have some pictures here just to kind of illustrate how some things have changed. And everybody on here would know that, but I still found it interesting, and also interesting that the upper left was 100 years ago. So my great grandfather, Albert Helmers, with the horses on the family farm, and then the lower right would have been harvest or threshing um, there in the family farm in Osceola County. Not the exact area that I'll talk about, but within about 5 miles away. And we think about that threshing and how things have changed. This was probably toward the end of my grandfather harvesting. My uncle has taken over the farm now, but certainly the equipment that was used has changed dramatically. And as we'll talk about, the land use that we have in the area has changed dramatically as well. As we think about some of the tillage practices, some of the younger folks may not recognize what that implement is in the upper left. That would be a cultivator, weed control for corn and soybeans. Um, I always dreaded having to do the cultivating, the little cultivating I did, because that was a 12-row piece of equipment, and if you got off, there was no hiding your mistake. And my grandfather would see that mistake either at harvest time or um, when we were riding beans. So, but that would have been done for weed control, and something that we hardly see any of nowadays. And so certainly some have talked about with more concerns about herbicide resistant weeds. Would we need to do more cultivating in season? And that would be the type of implement that would have been used at that time. Um, and that's me by the 12-row planter, probably about 1980, somewhere in that time frame, 81. Um, as most areas of Iowa, our farms also, you found challenges with drainage. And so you can see here, the picture is not very good, but um, that's me. And that's 3 different tractors, 2 of which are stuck in an area that was, pretty wet on a side hill when my grandfather was plowing. But now let's look at, kind of some of the changes that have happened also on the landscape, if we think about that, and also maybe some of the changes that we've seen with precipitation or climate. So this was a 1958 photo of the farm place and the area of land that we'll be talking about. And you can see, in the foreground, we see fences, we see some pasture there. You also see, piles of ear corn there. So quite a bit different than, say, in probably the early 1990s, actually, yeah, or late 1980s. This would be that same farm place, and you can see no more pastures there. All the fences were gone by that time, and so quite a different land use that we see on that landscape. So a couple years ago, one of the colleagues here with Iowa Nutrient Research Center, Malcolm Robertson, started putting together some information on just a second. There's a problem with the chat box for a second. Jackie said she can't chat with everyone. So, oh, there we go. Okay, now it should work. That you should be able to send a chat to the whole group. Okay, looked at precipitation changes since the late 1890s in this part of the state. So for crop reporting district, this would be for Northwest Iowa. Thought this was pretty interesting. Since the late 1800s, roughly seen a 4 to 5% increase in precipitation through that time. So that's important as we think about some of our land use changes that we'll talk about and some of the implications for water. When has a lot of that come? What we found was that a lot of that has come in the spring of the year. So this is the second quarter, April, May, and June. And over that, over 100 years, we've gone from just a little over 10 inches to probably about 13 and a half inches. So about a 3-inch increase just in that spring period of the year. Certainly has implications as we think about management operations and timeliness of field operations in the spring of the year. Okay, so let's think about this landscape. And so this is, can we look to the past to kind of see what's happened and think about the future? And so this is, on the left is kind of a present day or about 8 to 10 years ago. On the right, 1930s. And if it's kind of tough to see, but that one, the 1930s, what we see is a lot smaller fields, and we would see a lot different crop rotation during that period as well. Double check here. Okay. So one of the things that I did was I wish I had the date. I know it was my grandfather wrote it Saturday, March 5th, but I don't know the year. But I asked him if he would be willing to write out, what were some of the field operations and the changes that he had seen from, his boyhood days in the 1930s to more present day. And he wrote about the different field operations that he saw. And certainly in the 1930s, we had a fall tillage with a moldboard plow. In the 1950s, development of a field cultivator made for spring conditioning, chisel plow in the 1970s, and then the 1990s to present, where we have disc, chisel plow, maybe deep rippers, but also strip till and maybe no till. And so as you start looking at the number of field operations that would happen for corn crop, say, for example, in the 1930s, it's kind of amazing that it'd be 4 or 5 tillage operations, where fall tillage, um, even some tillage after the drag that might go after the planting season. And so what we did was, is we looked through this, we took all of that information and put it into a model that I'll talk about here in a second, the WEP model, to look at the different management operations that happen. So, tried to, we look here at present day, obsolete of a moldboard plow. So that would not have been done. You can see here some of the changes in how things were harvested, with by hand in the 30s, single to double row equipment in the 50s to 70s, and then 4 to 8 row equipment more present day. Okay, so as we started to look at this, and the Census of Ag is a great resource, we could start looking at what's changed with the landscape in Osceola County. So this isn't necessarily particular to this field or this small watershed, but for the county. And you can see pretty dramatic changes that we went from, about 30% row crops in Osceola County to over 80% present day. So, gone from 30 in the 30s to present day, 80s. And, a big part of that has been that we've reduced the small grains, we've reduced pasture and hay ground in those areas. So we've moved from a more diverse cropping rotation to a more annual cropping rotation, corn and soybeans. So this, again, not anything anybody doesn't know, but what we wanted to look at was how is that impacted, or would we project it to impact water flow and sediment delivery from the landscape. So we use the Water Erosion Prediction Project model to simulate water flow and sediment delivery. We use the land use and management derived from the Census of Ag, old publications, and personal communication, as I talked about with my grandfather. We applied this to a 1,160 acre watershed in Northwest Iowa. And so this is the one that the estimated erosion pre-settlement. And what you see is almost all green, maybe a little yellow, but almost all green, less than 1 ton per acre per year. So this would have been under the perennial system. We would have had hardly any, we would have estimated hardly any erosion with that perennial based system. Okay, but now let's look at the 1930s, 50s, 70s, and more present day. And I'll show you the overall results of what we predicted at the outlet of the watershed. But because of the annual row crop, what we're going to see is that certain parts of that watershed are going to be, in the reds, 5 to up to 20 ton per acre per year soil loss. And this one area kind of in the middle, that piece of ground, there's some sloping land. In fact, the picture I showed of the tractors being stuck is kind of on the northern edge of that, where that side hill starts there. But you can see, a couple things, especially in the 50s and 70s, we see maybe a little more red area than we do in either the 30s or the present day. The 30s, we would have had, more crop rotation in that system, more small grain, more pasture, hay ground. Present day, we'd have more annual row crops, but our tillage would have changed dramatically. The intensity of tillage would be less in the present day than in the 70s or the 50s. So if we estimate the runoff and sediment loss throughout the years for this area, so I broke it up into pre-settlement, 1930s, 1950s, 70s, present day, and then especially for the sediment, I went in and looked at what we might expect if we did strip till over this whole watershed. This area is mainly a conventional conservation tillage, but from our estimate, not really any strip till and very little no till. So what we estimate is that as we went from a perennial system pre-settlement to maybe the annual row crop system, we'd estimate an increase in annual runoff with that. And, that's kind of what we might expect because we don't have something growing out there as great a percent of the year. But if we go to more strip till or no till, leaving more residue on the land surface, there we estimate a reduction in runoff. So, kind of over the past, I think we've had an increase in runoff from the same landscape. And I think in the future, if we implement some of these conservation practices like strip till and no till, we could reduce that. As we start looking at the soil loss, this is, I think, pretty interesting. So pre-settlement, as we showed with the one map, very little soil loss. We're talking well below a 1 ton per acre per year at the outlet of the watershed. As we start looking at this, we really increase from pre-settlement to the 30s, increase more as we move to the 1950s land use. And the greatest estimated soil loss would be the 1970s when we're almost all annual row crop in this area and pretty intense tillage with moldboard plow in some cases. So we're not leaving very much residue cover. If we go to the present day, this is where kind of a positive story is that because we've implemented some reduced tillage practices, or certainly our conservation tillage or even conventional tillage is less aggressive than moldboard plowing than the 1970s. We estimate a less soil loss in tons per acre per year than something under the 1970s, and we could even further reduce that with strip till or no till. So I think this is a case of our runoff maybe is greater than it was pre-settlement, and certainly present might be higher than the 30s, 50s, or 70s. But we've made progress on that soil erosion because we, in most cases in this part of the state and others, we're keeping more residue cover on the land and reducing some of our soil erosion. Okay, now we'll move on. Okay, again, our land use. I wanted to look at what we might expect from a nitrate loss then from this type of system as we go from a more diverse cropping rotation to an annual row crop system. Okay, so again, 1,160 acres using the MLRA average, at least modern day, of 184 pounds of N per acre, primarily conventional to conservation tillage. Okay, so this is when I run it through the spreadsheet model that we have for the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and I put in this part of the state, MLRA 107A in Northwest Iowa. I put in our land area for this, and I put in kind of the crop rotations and the management practices from a nitrogen management perspective. And so, estimate that we're losing, if we look at pre-settlement under a perennial system, we would estimate very little nitrate loss. We're down, maybe 2 to 3 parts per million. So the top one is pounds per acre of nitrate loss. The bottom one is the milligrams per liter of nitrate concentration that we would estimate exiting this 1,160 acre watershed. And if we look at that pre-settlement, perennial based system, we're estimating less than 5 pounds per acre of nitrate loss and concentration of 2 to 3. And I think that's a little on the high side of what we might expect from a perennial, but that's what we predicted. Now, if we look at the 1950s and the 1930s, kind of similar from a landscape scale, still some pasture and hay, probably a little more small grains in the 30s than in the 50s. By the 50s, we would have had some soybeans in that area. But at that time, because we still have, I think, 30-some% of that landscape in a perennial system, pasture, hay, our nitrate loss is about 10 pounds per acre with a nitrate concentration of about 6. As we look at the 1970s, in this case, there was still a little small grain and a little pasture land in this watershed. And in that case, then we're up to, close to 20, about 18 pounds per acre of nitrate loss and a concentration of about 11 parts per million. And then we look at present day where we have, this whole watershed in annual row crops, or nearly the whole thing other than some road ditches and so forth. And we're estimating close to 25 pounds per acre of nitrate loss per year with a concentration of about 12. That's not dissimilar from what we'd expect from, lots of areas of Iowa. But we can see that as we've changed from a perennial to more extended rotation to an annual row crop system, we've increased nitrate loss. But, can we think about then toward the future of, what can we do to improve that, to reduce that nitrate loss? And so, I kind of put this in here with some of the nitrogen management solutions that we have in the nutrient reduction strategy. Present day, about 12 parts per million is what we estimated. If we reduce that N rate, and I don't know what the N rate is in this watershed, for the present day, I use the major land resource area average, which was 184. And if we reduce that maybe to about 150 or 160, you can see we go from about 12 to 10. If we then also put cover crops on about 50% of the acres in the watershed, we're getting down to just a little over 8 parts per million. If I did a bioreactor, for those, we're not going to get into what that is, but the wood chip trench that we're going to treat tile drainage water with, and there we did 10% of the land area with a bioreactor. We might get down to about 8. And then if we could treat all 1,160 acres with a wetland as well. So in this case, reduced N rate, cover crops on 50% of the acres, bioreactor to treat 10%, and a wetland, we've gone from about 12 parts per million down to about 4 to 5 parts per million. So if we take that systems approach and think of all of those practices, this is an area a wetland might work kind of right at the exit of the watershed. Wouldn't work in all areas, but might work here. We could really get pretty tremendous nitrate reduction. Just as kind of for those that aren't familiar, the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy relative to the hypoxia action plan calls for a 45% load reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus down the river. And so if we did all of these practices, we'd get greater than a 45% reduction from that 12 or 1,160 acre parcel of ground. So as we think about what's changed over the last 100 years, is a couple of those pictures. Our management has changed. Ag engineers have been very effective in building new machinery that makes it more efficient to farm and more efficient to farm larger acres. Our crop rotations have changed dramatically with an increase in annual row crop. I would say our tillage intensity on each of those row crop acres has decreased pretty dramatically. And those tillage improvements or less tillage intensity have led to less soil erosion, less soil loss at that watershed scale. But more annual row crops have led to increased nitrate loss. And I think our future solutions, we can kind of think back to, some of our historic land use. If we had more, I didn't have it in here, I should have. Well, I guess we did with the 1930s and 50s. If we went to a more diverse cropping system, that can help us reduce that nitrogen loss with leaching. And as we think about it, I think for future solutions, we'll need to think about a range of practices, not only things like cover crops, bioreactors, wetlands, the extended crop rotations where it's useful, maybe buffer strips and prairie strips in certain areas, but didn't get into that too much here. So with that, I will let you know if you're on and would like or need a CCA CEU. If you had to listen to me and you need a credit, make sure you email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And then, so again, that's Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. if you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we would certainly appreciate it. If you've done it for a 2023 webinar, thank you very much. And you only need to do it once for, we'll say calendar year 2023. I don't know what our reporting period, if it's fiscal or federal fiscal or state fiscal, but we're going to say calendar year 2023. You can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. And then put a plug in for the webinar next week, which Nancy Bowl-Borman from North Central Iowa, but a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, and she's going to talk about the creation and launch of the largest manure nutrient database in the U.S. So that's going to be great. That is really great work that she and Melissa Wilson have been doing at the University of Minnesota. So those interested in manure, please log on and get that. I'm going to show one last slide for those that know me right there. I guess at a young age, I was a Nebraska Cornhusker fan. So, some things turn all the way around, and those that know me know I follow Nebraska football a little bit too much. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, Jackie.
Okay, Matt just doesn't know how to let someone else host a webinar. Those were all supposed to be my responsibilities. But anyway, so go ahead and Matt, we've already got a bunch of questions coming in. And one of my questions that I had actually links to a question somebody else had. When you showed the slide that showed the land use back in the 30s and then present land use, where you were showing smaller fields, obviously a lot of diversity in the fields, and then we see larger fields, and we know we've gone to more monocropping or two crops.
Row cropping.
Yeah. So what are the what do you think if you would combine the 1930 land use diversity with modern cropping and management practices? And then what are some of the other implications of going from smaller fields to larger fields in terms of how we're managing this land?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so if somebody was listening like closely, that's what just that question about combining modern practices with the 30s or 50s land use was like what went through my mind as we think about solutions for the future. And I think it holds great promise in many ways because we could have that 1930s land use. Okay, if there's a market for it, if we can do it, we could have that 1930s land use without some of the tillage intensity. Now, that would require us to use herbicides, but that's used modern day. And so I think what we would see is that we would see much less soil erosion than we predicted in the 1930s, specifically because of that. I think we might see somewhat similar nitrate losses in 1930s because our tillage doesn't influence N loss as much as it does with the sediment loss. As we think about the field sizes as well, I think that is important because while a lot of it hasn't factored it in, if we think back to the 30s, 50s, maybe even the 70s, each one of those fence rows might have served as a point to slow water down. So even moving to those larger field sizes has probably allowed, more runoff to occur in certain areas, or more runoff to get all the way to the outlet rather than maybe, stopping and being slowed down in that specific field. So that's one thing I think of with the water flow.
Okay, so we've got several questions here about where you're discussing nitrate loss and runoff. And you also showed a chart that showed the increase in precipitation. So I'm guessing those are related. Yeah. It's not just the change in what you're doing on the land, it's also related to rainfall increase.
So the N loss that I showed was with kind of a constant precipitation, but what we would expect and even some of the soil erosion, it did use 100-year precip, but so it would show probably a little of that. No. When we did the scenarios with the soil erosion, we used the same weather for all the periods. Okay. So all of these are using constant weather so that that's not one of the factors. But what we would expect is if we look at, weather now versus the early 1900s, what we would expect is, if you were doing the same management in both of those periods, we would expect more soil loss, more nitrate loss in the current time with the same management both periods because we're getting more rainfall. That would mean more water flow and nutrient loss from the system. Also, it's kind of makes it a little worse because that we're getting that spring rainfall when, especially with, if we're looking at the land use we have now, we don't have much out there to protect it, if that makes sense. So
Okay, so
just makes it worse with the climatic changes.
going on with NLOS, is there more tile drainage since the 70s? And second is, does your model include water that was infiltrated? So when you're doing this, how are you predicting runoff prediction?
So the wet model does predict infiltration. So when we did that, it predicts infiltration, but the model's really not able to change the soil hydraulic properties based on kind of compaction that might be happening or so forth. So the wet model does factor in infiltration, but it doesn't necessarily change soil structure throughout time based on the different land use you have out there. So what's interesting is this is a watershed that there has been a little bit of change, from my recollection, my understanding, a little changes in some tile drainage, but not not a tremendous amount. And actually, most of it all still drains through my grandpa always called it a county main. I don't think it's a drainage district main, but drains through one drainage main toward the outlet of the watershed so that, in this case, there hasn't been a lot of new pattern drainage in the field, but even if there was, it's still kind of restricted by the outlet system that we have there, or that is there.
So, so somebody's asking us about P and P loss. He says here that Iowa State increased phosphorus loss, found that increase of phosphorus loss with no-till. K-State says increase of P loss with cover crops. Wood chip bioreactors, saturated buffers, and wetlands do not reduce P loss. So you're just asking, like, what do you recommend, or when are we going to recommend that P application rates go lower?
Okay.
Because wherever he's working, they're seeing P levels increasing over the last 20 years.
Yeah. Well, so I mean that's a good question, and a lot of it is going to depend on what you see, what form of phosphorus, whether it's particulate P or dissolved P. And so I think our no-till and our cover crops can reduce some of the total P losses. Certain cases there might be some increase in dissolved P based on the runoff that we might see. Still work needed on the understanding dissolved P in leaching. One of the things though that we found is that we do need to reduce soil test phosphorus if we are high in soil test phosphorus levels, and reduce P applications in those fields. One of the problems with that is we're talking about decadal changes, in some cases to reduce that soil test P, so it's going to take a while. There are, we've had talks on here before about some of the P filters that Chad Penn is working on, and we've had some increased dialogue here about the potential for implementing some of those, or trying a demonstration site or two on the P filters that might help us specifically with dissolved P. It's a challenge with the dissolved P on what to do. Certainly we want to bring down that soil test phosphorus, but that's talking about, again, we can't do that particularly quick if we are very high or above in our soil test phosphorus levels.
Okay, so Matt, the person who asked this question said that you didn't necessarily have to answer it publicly, but because I'm a social scientist, I'm going to make you answer this publicly. Okay, so you're using your family farm.
Yeah.
And you were
Yeah.
suggesting some
Oh,
practices should get there. What is
yeah.
it like? I mean, how are you navigating or negotiating, talking to your family about these practices, and have they adopted any of these
Uh,
things like cover crops, bioreactors, a wetland?
yeah. So, yeah, my uncle has used cover crops a time or two. I think one of our challenges up there is, getting consistent growth. But at least on some of the farms have been used. Um, so not as much on the bioreactors. So um, although I'm somewhat curious about maybe a new emerging practice, saturated grassed waterway, because I think actually, uh, the fields that my family has in this watershed maybe are not as conducive to a bioreactor as maybe some of the other fields. But there could be an emerging practice that Keith Schilling and Tom Eisenhardt are looking at, which is a saturated grassed waterway. Um, we might have a field for that. Um, I
So how
have
do you go
thought,
about talking them into
oh,
that, Matt?
well,
I
well,
get that intellectually.
we gotta bring it up. I gotta bring it up and talk about it. That one not going to take land out of production, so maybe that will be the case. But the I've often thought the ideal location for the wetland or a potential one is on the downstream landowner, not one of our farms, but downstream. They put in about an 80-acre CRP at the start of a ditch there. I always thought that could have been a potential wetland location, but haven't talked to anybody. So I haven't done my homework. I have not done my part.
Okay, so we got a couple more questions, and these are excellent questions. So much of the modeling estimates regarding amount of cover crops bioreactors that we would need seem to assume status quo corn and bean acres.
Oh,
But what kind of impact would a shift to other crops like the small grains, the pasture, the hay have? Given that we artificially support current crop markets, what if we subsidize shift to these other crops into livestock systems and not large confinements, more of
yeah,
a grazing situation?
forage-based system. I think all of those would have benefits if we just a guiding principle of something growing on the landscape a greater percent of the year, it would do it. If we had more time, I'd pull up the spreadsheet and we could go through some different scenarios. But um, if we move to a more diverse cropping system, um, we would expect a reduction in nitrate loss. That's we're looking at that. Put a little plug in for our relay intercropping project that Jackie and Mark Licht and Ross Evelsizer and Alex Schaefer, Alex with Iowa soybean, Ross with RC&D in Northeast Iowa. Looking at can we grow rye, harvest that rye, and then harvest soybeans in that same year. So we'd have something growing out there a greater percentage of the year. Now we'd have to have a market for that rye. We'd want to market maybe more than just for cover crops. But I think all those things have the potential for reducing our nitrate leaching and protecting our soil surface from those spring rainfall events.
Okay, I've got some over on the other chat. Somebody said that it would be interesting for you to look at diversity wildlife changes too, like to add to this.
Hey,
So
that's beyond my that one's beyond. I'm gonna really say that is beyond my level of I'm uh, yeah,
it is, but I
yeah,
think one of the things, I think the point being is that it's a really powerful thing to tell this story of Iowa through one farm and one small watershed. That being able to get the real picture, including wildlife and other things, to say,
yeah,
really, how did land management change, and then how did that impact the whole ecological system?
yeah.
And I think that's a great question. Um, would it be useful to develop a similar case study for other MLRA and or the major soil association areas? Because this was a small
Yeah.
watershed that you looked at. Would it help to get local folks' attention to what can change with reduced N rates and no-till and cover
I,
crops and some of the other
I
practices?
yes, I think so. And Jackie, we did a little bit of that long ago. So everything comes back around. We've been around so long that everything comes back around.
Kind of scats.
About 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we did a little bit of that for some of the um, research farm or some of our Iowa Learning Farm partners kind of throughout the state. And that was mainly with soil erosion and thinking about specific conservation practices. But we could do something similar even with nitrate loss, and then even bringing up thinking about it just using the census of ag for what the land use. So yeah, I think I appreciate that suggestion, and is something that we could definitely do.
Okay, Matt,
And oh,
yeah, go ahead.
nope,
Would you
nope,
want
nope, nothing.
So, does your model take wind and soil movement through
Uh,
rainfall into account?
Soil movement from rainfall. This does not include wind erosion. So, yep. So it is
Okay.
just water erosion prediction project. There is a is it WEP, wind erosion project model, but we in this case it was the water erosion prediction project model.
Matt, we were just up in that neck of the woods, not quite as far as Sibley, but it looks to me like if we have snow this winter, we're going to see a lot of snort because there's been a lot of tillage this fall because it's been so nice. So wind erosion seems to be at play, and you especially can see that during the winter.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep, we were by Gilmore City, and there was a field that already had probably, less than 10% residue cover, and we'll see a fair bit of wind erosion unless we have a big snowpack this winter.
So somebody else is suggesting maybe you could involve an economist to understand the changes of managing costs to the farmers moving through large acre row crops from the 1930s patchwork diversified model to today. I mean, the thing is, I think what you're hearing from a lot of the attendees, Matt, is that this project is engaging. If we could add all the components to it and tell that story, it could actually be a powerful learning tool.
Yep. Well, that's great. Hopefully it's kind of interesting, and somebody could tell even a better story with better visuals than me, but hopefully it kind of gets us thinking about what's happened over the last 100 years, and what some of our changes might mean if we did implement some of these things in the future.
It'd also be a great dissertation for a historian, an ag historian.
So this field down, I don't know if folks can see it in this kind of just outside of our watershed outlet. That's the start of a ditch. I've always thought that would be a prime location for a wetland.
But it belongs to the neighbor, right?
It does. That one is not any of our family.
Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Helmers? All right. Well, Matt, you did a great job. You clearly had a lot of people interested in what you had to say on the family farm. Appreciate you being willing to take this Wednesday before Thanksgiving to share with our audience and our webinar followers. A lot of people here are shouting out saying they really enjoyed it. It was great. Look at some of the history and how that relates to the present day. Just a reminder again, let's put up the slide on the webinar next week.
Yeah. Nancy Bowl-Borman, if you are interested in manure, you need to get on.
And even if you're not, you should get on.
Hey, this is really important. So
this
Nancy
is important.
Bowl-Borman.
Nancy's also one of our farmer partners. So it's really great to be having her speak for us next week. Thank you all. We'll see you next week.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Jackie.
All right.
Yeah.
How do I just sign out, or what do we do?
We just sign out. And so there's not as, So
are we?
I'll give you, it's still broadcasting right now, is it?